"We can't keep hiding that anymore." Those were the exact words that changed everything in that moment. Spoken so casually that anyone listening without context would have thought it was nothing more than a tired comment at the end of a long day. But for me, standing just a few feet away in the hallway of the Walker household, it felt like the air itself had frozen. David Walker was staring at Susan Walker with a look I had never seen before. Not anger, not fear, but something heavier, like a truth he had been carrying for years and could no longer hold inside. Susan's reaction was immediate, almost instinctive, her hand tightening around the edge of the kitchen counter as her eyes flicked toward the living room where I was supposed to be, not paying attention, as if she could somehow erase what had just been said by sheer force of denial. For most people, the Walker family looked stable from the outside, the kind of suburban American household that blended perfectly into quiet mornings, neatly trimmed lawns, and polite conversations with neighbors in a town where nothing ever seemed out of place. But living inside that structure told a completely different story. I had learned early on that silence in this house was never empty. It was controlled, calculated, and sometimes heavier than words themselves. That night started like any other, with the hum of the refrigerator, the soft glow of the kitchen light, and David sitting at the table reviewing what he called family matters, a phrase he used so often it stopped sounding like it meant anything specific. Susan was standing near the sink, pretending to organize dishes that were already clean, a habit she had whenever she wanted to avoid a conversation without actually leaving the room. I remember thinking how normal everything appeared at a glance, how someone walking past the house would never suspect that beneath this calm surface, conversations were layered with things never fully said out loud. Then came that moment, the sentence that broke through all of it. "We can't keep hiding that anymore." Susan turned her head slowly, as if she was trying to convince herself she had misheard him, but David didn't repeat it, didn't soften it, didn't explain it away. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaling like someone who had just set down a weight they could no longer carry alone. I felt my stomach tighten because there was something about the way he said it that didn't sound like a question or even a confession, but more like the beginning of something already in motion long before I became aware of it. Susan's voice, when it finally came, was carefully controlled, almost too controlled, the kind of tone people use when they're trying not to let emotion escape through the cracks. She asked him what he was talking about, but the question didn't feel real. It felt rehearsed, like she already knew the answer but refused to acknowledge it. David glanced toward me briefly, just for a second, and in that glance I saw something that made my chest tighten further, a silent recognition that I was no longer just an observer in this household dynamic. The room suddenly felt smaller, like the walls had moved in slightly without anyone noticing. Susan followed his gaze, and her expression shifted in a way I couldn't immediately decode. Part warning, part fear, part frustration, all tangled together. For a few seconds, no one spoke, and in that silence I realized this wasn't just a random argument or a passing disagreement. It was the surface cracking open on something that had been buried for a very long time, something neither of them had fully admitted even to themselves. And in that fragile silence, I understood that whatever came next would not stay hidden for long. After that moment, the silence in the kitchen did not disappear. It deepened, as if the house itself was waiting for someone to decide what reality we were supposed to accept next. David Walker slowly pushed his chair back just a few inches, not enough to break the tension, but enough to signal that whatever he had said was not accidental. Susan Walker kept her hands on the counter, but I noticed her fingers were no longer just gripping it for support. They were holding on like she was afraid the floor beneath her might shift if she let go. I stayed where I was in the hallway, pretending to be invisible, but there was no longer any real possibility of that. Every small sound in the house felt amplified, the faint ticking of the kitchen clock, the distant hum of appliances, even the soft fabric movement when Susan shifted her weight. David finally spoke again, his voice lower than before, more deliberate, as if he was choosing each word carefully to avoid triggering something that had already been unstable for a long time. He said they had reached a point where continuing the way things were would only make things worse, but he did not explain what things he meant, and that absence of clarity made everything heavier. Susan responded immediately, too quickly to be casual, insisting that there was nothing to continue or stop, that whatever he was implying was not real or not relevant anymore. Her tone carried a sharp edge of denial that did not match the calm environment she was trying to maintain, and that contrast made it more noticeable rather than less. I remember watching her closely, noticing how she avoided direct eye contact with David and instead focused on small objects around the kitchen, like the edge of a mug or the folded dish towel near the sink, as if grounding herself in anything that was not the conversation itself. David exhaled again, slower this time, and leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. He said that pretending everything was normal had already gone on longer than it should have, and that continuing to ignore it was no longer possible. The way he said it was not aggressive, but it carried a finality that made it sound like a decision had already been made somewhere long before this moment. Susan's expression tightened, and she finally turned fully toward him, her voice rising just enough to break the controlled surface she had been maintaining. She insisted that he was the one rewriting history, that he was the one changing details that had always been consistent. And as she spoke, I noticed something unsettling, not just disagreement, but a structured attempt to reshape what was being remembered. That was the first time I realized this was not a simple argument between two people, but something far more complicated, like two versions of the same story competing to exist in the same room. David shook his head slightly, not in anger, but in disappointment, as if he had already heard every variation of this response before and knew exactly where it would lead. He said there were records, messages, and conversations that could not be ignored indefinitely, and even though he did not specify what those were, the way Susan reacted told me she understood exactly what he meant. Her posture changed subtly, her shoulders tightening, her breathing becoming more controlled, and for the first time she looked directly at me, not as if I were part of the family moment, but as if I were a variable she had not accounted for. The kitchen felt colder even though nothing in the environment had changed, and I began to understand that what I had always perceived as a stable household was actually built on layers of carefully maintained silence. David stood up slowly from the table, not abruptly, but with the kind of movement that signals resolve rather than emotion. He looked at Susan for a long moment and said that avoiding it any longer was no longer an option, because the truth was already starting to surface whether they controlled it or not. And in that instant, I realized that whatever had been buried in this family was no longer something that could remain hidden inside the walls of this house. The moment David Walker stood up from the table, the entire atmosphere in the kitchen shifted again, not abruptly, but in a way that felt like the structure of the conversation itself was beginning to reorganize around something none of us could fully see yet. Susan Walker did not move at first. She remained facing him, her posture stiff and controlled, but her eyes were no longer focused on him as a person. They were focused on what he represented in that moment, which felt like a threat to something carefully maintained over a long period of time. I stayed in the hallway, still pretending I was not part of what was unfolding. But the truth was there was no longer any separation between observer and participant. David walked slowly toward the counter, not in a confrontational way, but with the calm precision of someone who had already decided what needed to be said and was no longer interested in delaying it. He placed one hand on the edge of the counter, not leaning on it for support, but as if grounding himself before continuing. He said that this was not about a single misunderstanding or a recent disagreement, but about a pattern that had repeated itself for years, small inconsistencies that had slowly accumulated into something that could no longer remain unnoticed. Susan immediately responded, her voice sharper now, insisting that there were no patterns, only interpretations being twisted after the fact, and as she spoke, I noticed how carefully she avoided any specific detail, as if precision itself was dangerous. David did not interrupt her. He waited, and that silence made her words feel less stable with each passing second. When she finished, he said that avoiding specifics was exactly the problem, because the lack of clarity had allowed everything to remain unresolved for too long. At that point, Susan stepped away from the counter for the first time, not toward him, but slightly backward, creating physical distance as if that could restore emotional control. She said that if there were supposed records or messages, then they should have already been shown, and that continuing to speak in vague terms only proved that there was nothing concrete to discuss. The way she said it sounded confident, but there was an undercurrent of urgency that did not match her words. David nodded slightly, as if acknowledging that expectation, but instead of responding immediately, he turned his attention toward the living room table where a stack of papers had been sitting unnoticed. He walked over and picked them up slowly, not revealing them yet, but holding them in a way that made their presence impossible to ignore. I noticed Susan's eyes follow that movement immediately, and for the first time, her composure seemed to fracture just slightly at the edges. She asked what those papers were, but her tone had changed, no longer purely defensive, now mixed with something closer to concern. David replied calmly that they were part of the history that could no longer be dismissed or reinterpreted, and that avoiding them would not change what they contained. Susan shook her head, insisting that documents can be misleading, that context matters more than isolated pages, and that taking things out of sequence could distort meaning entirely. But even as she said this, her voice was less steady, and I could see her attention dividing between David, the papers, and me, as if she was trying to calculate how much of this moment was already out of her control. David placed the papers back on the table, not opening them yet, but positioning them so they were visible to everyone in the room. He said that the issue was no longer interpretation, but acknowledgement, and that continuing to deny what had already been documented would only delay what was coming next. The room felt increasingly confined, not physically, but in the way conversations can narrow until there are fewer and fewer directions left to go. Susan remained standing, but she was no longer occupying the space with the same certainty as before, and for the first time, I understood that whatever was inside those papers was not just information, but something that had the potential to change everything that had been assumed up to this point. The stack of papers sitting on the living room table seemed to change the entire weight of the room without anyone physically touching them, as if their presence alone had introduced a level of permanence that words could no longer undo. David Walker kept his hand resting near them, not opening them yet, but also not moving them away, and that hesitation itself felt more intentional than anything he had said so far. Susan Walker stood several feet away now, no longer near the kitchen counter, her position in the room shifting into something more defensive, though she was still trying to maintain the appearance of control. I remained in the hallway, fully aware that there was no longer any way to separate myself from what was happening, even if I stayed silent and still. David finally spoke again, his voice steady but lower, and he said that these documents were not new, not created in the heat of an argument, but something that had existed long before this conversation ever began. Susan immediately reacted, saying that existence alone did not make something accurate, and that interpretation could easily be influenced by selective framing, especially when someone was trying to rewrite a shared history. Her words were fast, more practiced than emotional, and I noticed how she avoided looking directly at the papers while still tracking every movement David made near them. David responded calmly that there was nothing selective about consistency, and that the same patterns appeared across different points in time, regardless of how they were framed. He did not raise his voice, but each sentence carried the weight of repetition, like he had already explained this in different ways long before I ever heard it. Susan took another step back, closer to the edge of the living room, as if increasing physical distance could reduce the pressure of the conversation. She said that if there were contradictions, they could be explained, and that explanations had simply never been given a fair chance to be fully understood. David nodded slightly, then finally picked up one of the documents, holding it at chest level without yet reading from it aloud, as if he was giving her one last opportunity to respond before moving forward. The silence that followed was not empty, it was dense, and it made every small sound in the house feel amplified again, including the faint ticking of a wall clock and the distant hum of evening traffic outside. I noticed that Susan's breathing had become more controlled, not calm, but deliberately regulated, as if she was trying to prevent any emotional reaction from becoming visible. David looked at her directly and said that avoiding specifics had allowed uncertainty to persist for too long, and that uncertainty had slowly shaped how everyone understood the past. He then lowered the document slightly, pointing to a section without reading it aloud yet, and said that this particular record had been referenced multiple times in previous conversations, even if those conversations had been dismissed or minimized afterward. Susan immediately interrupted, insisting that references did not equal conclusions, and that context could drastically change meaning if it was properly considered from the beginning rather than reconstructed later. Her tone sharpened again, but there was a noticeable strain underneath it, as if maintaining consistency in her argument required more effort with each exchange. David did not argue back immediately. Instead, he placed the document back on the table and picked up another one, creating a visible sequence that suggested a larger structure behind what was being revealed. He said that this was not about isolated interpretations, but about continuity across multiple records that all pointed in the same direction when viewed together. At that moment, Susan's expression changed slightly, not into anger, but into something more unsettled, as if she was recognizing that the conversation was no longer about winning an argument, but about managing exposure. I stayed still in the hallway, realizing that the dynamic in front of me was no longer just a disagreement between two people, but a gradual collapse of competing narratives, and that whatever came next would depend less on persuasion and more on what could no longer be denied. The more documents David Walker placed on the table, the more the room began to feel like it was organizing itself around evidence rather than conversation, as if every sheet of paper added another layer of structure that words alone could no longer override. Susan Walker remained standing near the edge of the living room, her position unchanged, but her presence in the space felt noticeably different, less stable, more divided between reaction and restraint. I stayed in the hallway, but even from that distance, I could see how the dynamic had shifted from spoken disagreement to something closer to controlled exposure. David did not rush anymore. He moved slowly between the documents, selecting one at a time, not in a dramatic way, but with the consistency of someone following a sequence that had already been established long before this moment. He said that what mattered was not individual pages, but the repetition of details across different points in time, details that remained consistent even when explanations changed. Susan immediately responded that repetition did not guarantee truth, and that repeated claims could still be built on misunderstanding if the initial assumptions were flawed. Her voice was still firm, but I could hear a subtle tightening underneath it, as if maintaining that firmness required increasing effort. David looked at her for a long moment before replying that misunderstanding could not explain identical structures appearing across separate records, especially when those records were created under different circumstances. He then placed another document on top of the others, aligning them carefully as if building a visual timeline rather than presenting isolated evidence. Susan's eyes followed the movement, and for the first time she did not immediately respond. Instead, she hesitated, her attention fixed on the growing stack in a way that suggested she was trying to anticipate what would come next rather than react to what was already present. I noticed that the atmosphere in the house felt increasingly narrow, not physically, but in the way possibilities seemed to reduce with each passing sentence. David said that there were moments in the past where explanations had been offered but later withdrawn or reframed in ways that changed their original meaning, and that those changes themselves created a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Susan finally stepped forward slightly, breaking her earlier distance, and said that context had always been misinterpreted because it was being viewed from a single perspective rather than from the full picture. Her tone was more controlled now, less reactive, but there was a noticeable shift in how carefully she chose each phrase, as if every word had to be measured against potential consequences. David responded calmly that the full picture was exactly what had been missing, and that what had been presented so far was only fragments that pointed toward a larger continuity. He then opened one of the documents for the first time and turned it slightly so that part of its contents was visible, not to me, but directly towards Susan, who immediately focused on it with an intensity that revealed recognition rather than confusion. She did not speak for several seconds, and in that silence I realized that the conversation was no longer about persuading each other, but about managing what could no longer be separated from what had already been recorded. David said that avoidance had always depended on selective attention, and that selective attention eventually breaks down when enough connected information is placed side by side. Susan shook her head slightly, not in disagreement this time, but in something closer to disbelief mixed with resistance, as if acknowledging what she saw would require accepting a version of events she had worked hard to prevent from forming. The documents remained on the table, now arranged in a way that suggested progression rather than randomness, and I understood that whatever narrative had once held this family together was no longer intact in the way it used to be. The tension in the living room had shifted into something more precise now, no longer just emotional pressure, but a structured confrontation built entirely around what could be proven, implied, or denied in real time. David Walker kept the documents arranged on the table in a careful sequence, as if each page represented not just information, but a step in a larger progression that could not be reversed once fully revealed. Susan Walker stood closer than before, though still maintaining a controlled distance, her posture rigid in a way that suggested she was no longer simply reacting, but actively managing how she was being perceived. I remained in the hallway, but the boundary between observation and involvement had completely dissolved, and every word spoken in the room felt like it was also being directed toward me in some indirect way. David spoke again, his tone steady and measured, and he said that continuing to separate individual details from the broader timeline was exactly what had allowed confusion to persist for so long. Susan immediately responded that timelines could be reconstructed in multiple ways depending on which starting point was chosen, and that selecting a starting point itself was already an act of interpretation rather than fact. Her argument was consistent, but there was a noticeable increase in how carefully she structured each sentence, as if she was aware that any inconsistency could now be traced and compared. David nodded slightly and said that interpretation was only valid when it could account for every connected element, not just isolated segments that supported a preferred version of events. He then moved one document slightly forward on the table, aligning it with another, creating a visible continuity between them that suggested intentional order rather than coincidence. Susan's eyes followed the movement again, and I noticed that her breathing had become more controlled, not in a calm sense, but in a way that suggested active restraint. She said that records could still be incomplete, that missing context could completely change how the existing information should be understood, and that no conclusion should be drawn without acknowledging what might not be present. David replied that absence itself was also part of the pattern, especially when the same type of information consistently appeared while other expected elements were repeatedly missing. That statement created a pause in the room that felt longer than the silence itself, as if everyone was processing not just what was said, but what it implied. Susan looked briefly toward me again, then quickly back to David, and said that involving outside perception did not necessarily make an interpretation more accurate. It only made it more complicated and easier to misframe. Her voice remained controlled, but there was a slight instability beneath it, like she was trying to maintain a structure that was starting to resist reinforcement. David did not respond immediately. Instead, he picked up another document and placed it in front of her without pushing it closer, leaving the decision of whether to engage with it entirely to her. He said that at some point, complexity stops being an explanation and starts becoming a barrier, especially when the same barriers appear consistently across different attempts to clarify the situation. Susan finally looked down at the document, directly, and for the first time her expression shifted into something less defensive and more analytical, as if she was no longer only rejecting the narrative, but also evaluating how it had been constructed. I could see that whatever was written there was not new to her, but the act of seeing it placed in this structured sequence changed its weight entirely. She did not speak for several seconds, and during that silence David remained still, not pressing further, allowing the documents themselves to hold the conversation. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before, and she said that even if patterns existed, patterns alone did not define intent, and that without understanding motivation, interpretation could still be fundamentally flawed. David acknowledged this by saying that intent could be debated, but consistency could not be easily dismissed when it repeated across time, context, and record. The room felt increasingly defined by the table between them, not as a physical object, but as a boundary where narratives were being placed side by side for comparison. I realized at that moment that the conversation had moved beyond disagreement and was now focused on whether the structure of what had been recorded could still be resisted or whether it had already become too complete to deny. The conversation in the living room had reached a point where neither David Walker nor Susan Walker was simply reacting anymore. They were both actively trying to control how the structure of the entire situation would be understood moving forward. The documents on the table were no longer just papers. They had become reference points that defined the rhythm of every exchange, and even the silence between sentences felt organized around them. Susan stood with her attention locked on David, but her focus would occasionally shift to the arrangement of papers, as if she was tracking not just what was being said, but how each piece connected to the next. I remained in the hallway, but the sense of distance no longer felt meaningful, because every shift in tone, every pause, and every careful sentence carried enough weight to pull the entire space into a single focal point. David spoke first after the silence stretched for a moment, saying that patterns do not need emotional agreement to remain consistent, and that repeated alignment across different points in time creates structure whether it is acknowledged or not. Susan immediately responded, her voice more deliberate than before, stating that structure alone does not confirm intent, and that drawing conclusions without understanding purpose could distort the entire interpretation. Her phrasing was precise, almost overly controlled, as if she was carefully avoiding any statement that could later be tied back to a contradiction. David nodded slightly and said that intent could always be debated, but repetition across independent records was not easily manufactured or dismissed without explanation. He then adjusted the placement of another document on the table, aligning it with the others in a way that visually reinforced continuity rather than separation. Susan watched the movement closely and then said that the issue was not whether records existed, but how selectively they were being interpreted, suggesting that any incomplete set of information could be arranged to support multiple narratives. There was a brief pause after her statement, and in that pause I noticed that neither of them looked away, as if breaking eye contact would allow the other side to regain narrative control. David responded calmly that selectivity would require random absence, but what appeared here was not random. It was consistent omission of certain elements alongside consistent presence of others, and that imbalance itself formed part of the pattern. Susan took a slow breath and said that what he called omission could also be explained by relevance, that not all information carries equal weight, and that focusing on specific elements while ignoring broader context could lead to misinterpretation. Her voice remained steady, but I could sense an increasing effort behind it, as if each response required more calculation than the last. David did not raise his voice, but his tone became slightly firmer as he said that relevance cannot remain consistent across multiple independent points in time unless there is a guiding structure behind it, and that structure was what the documents were beginning to reveal when viewed together. Susan finally stepped closer to the table again, not fully closing the distance, but enough to engage more directly with the documents, and she said that even structured information can still be framed incorrectly if the observer already assumes a conclusion before analysis begins. David replied that assumption would not explain the internal consistency found across different records created under different circumstances, and that consistency was difficult to maintain accidentally at this scale. The room felt increasingly compressed around the table, as if the boundaries of the conversation had narrowed to only what could be defended, challenged, or aligned. I noticed Susan's expression change subtly, not into acceptance, but into a more focused scrutiny, as if she was now examining not just the documents themselves, but the possibility that the structure David was presenting could not be easily dismantled through reinterpretation alone. For the first time, the argument was no longer about isolated points, but about whether the entire framework holding those points together could still be questioned without collapsing under its own accumulation. The moment came without warning, not as a sudden explosion of emotion, but as a gradual collapse of restraint that had been building across every exchange in the living room. David Walker and Susan Walker were no longer speaking in the careful, structured way they had maintained earlier. The conversation had shifted into a direct confrontation where every sentence carried immediate weight and no longer allowed room for reinterpretation. The documents on the table, once arranged with precision, now felt like the center of gravity for everything happening around them. Susan stood closer than before, her position no longer defensive in distance but tense in focus, as if she had decided that remaining passive would no longer serve any purpose. I stayed in the hallway, But even from there, it was clear that the conversation had reached a point where both sides were no longer trying to persuade each other, but to establish which version of reality would remain standing after everything was said. David spoke first, his voice steady but more direct than before, stating that the consistency across multiple records was no longer something that could be dismissed as coincidence or selective framing. Susan immediately responded, her tone sharper now, saying that consistency alone does not eliminate the possibility of misinterpretation, especially when context is incomplete or intentionally narrowed. Her words came faster, but they were still controlled, as if she was trying to maintain a balance between emotional pressure and logical defense. David did not interrupt, but when she finished, he said that context cannot be used indefinitely as a shield against patterns that repeat regardless of framing, time, or presentation. At that moment, Susan stepped forward and placed her hand on the edge of the table, not pushing anything away, but anchoring herself physically in the space, as she said that patterns are still subject to interpretation, and that interpretation depends on which elements are prioritized and which are ignored. Her voice carried more intensity now, and I could see that the effort to maintain control was becoming more visible in her expression. David responded calmly that prioritization itself becomes meaningful when it consistently excludes the same categories of information while including others, and that such consistency suggests structure rather than randomness. He then tapped one of the documents lightly, not aggressively, but in a way that drew attention back to the physical evidence rather than the argument surrounding it. Susan looked down at the document and said that what he called exclusion could also be selection based on relevance, and that relevance is not fixed but defined by perspective. The room felt increasingly still during these exchanges, not because nothing was happening, but because every movement and every sentence seemed to narrow the available space for disagreement. David nodded slightly and said that if relevance were purely subjective, it would not produce the same alignment across independent records, created under different conditions. Susan paused at that, and for the first time there was a visible break in her immediate response, not silence, but hesitation that suggested she was reassessing the structure of her argument in real time. She then said that even aligned records could still be misleading if they were assembled without full disclosure of all contributing factors, and that absence of information does not automatically indicate significance. David replied that absence becomes significant when it repeatedly occurs in the same structured way alongside consistent presence of other elements, and that this combination was no longer easy to explain through coincidence or interpretation alone. At that point, the conversation shifted again, not into resolution, but into a deeper confrontation of frameworks, where both sides were no longer arguing individual points, but the validity of how those points were being connected. Susan's posture tightened slightly, and she said that what he was presenting was still incomplete, because no structure is valid without total context, and that any system built on partial information will inevitably produce distorted conclusions. David looked at her for a moment and said that waiting for total context had already allowed the situation to persist far longer than it should have, and that at some point, partial but consistent information becomes more reliable than complete uncertainty. The documents remained spread across the table, now forming a visible structure that neither of them could ignore, and I realized that whatever truth had been buried within this family was no longer hidden by silence, but was now being shaped by how much of it could be openly acknowledged before everything finally reached its breaking point. The silence that followed felt different from all the pauses that had come before it, because this time it was not hesitation or calculation, but the absence of anything left to rearrange in the same way as before. David Walker and Susan Walker stood on opposite sides of the living room table, the documents between them no longer functioning as simple evidence, but as the final structure that had been built through every previous exchange. I remained in the hallway, but even that distance no longer provided separation, because everything in the room had converged into a single unresolved point that neither side could extend without consequence. David spoke first, his voice no longer exploratory but conclusive, stating that the patterns were not dependent on interpretation anymore, because they had already repeated across enough independent records to establish continuity. Susan did not respond immediately, and when she finally did, her voice was quieter than before, not weakened but more deliberate. as she said that continuity alone does not define truth if the underlying framework is still incomplete. Her words carried less resistance now, and more of a controlled attempt to hold on to a final layer of structure that had not yet fully collapsed. David looked at her and said that waiting for completeness had already delayed acknowledgement far beyond a reasonable point, and that partial but consistent alignment across time was no longer something that could be dismissed as coincidence or framing. He then placed his hand lightly on the edge of the table, not emphasizing the documents, but emphasizing the finality of their arrangement, as if the structure itself had already finished forming regardless of further discussion. Susan turned her attention briefly toward the documents again, and for the first time, there was no immediate rebuttal, only a careful observation that suggested she was no longer trying to win the argument, but to evaluate what remained of it. She said that even if patterns existed, meaning could still shift depending on what was excluded, and that exclusion itself required context that was not always visible in structured records. David responded that exclusion only becomes meaningful when it changes randomly, but when it remains consistent across different points in time, it begins to form its own structure that cannot be ignored without disregarding the entire sequence. The room felt completely still at that point, not in a tense way, but in a way that suggested no further escalation was possible without breaking the current structure entirely. Susan lowered her gaze to the table and said that if what was presented was accurate, then it would redefine everything that had been assumed about the past, and that such a redefinition could not happen without consequences that extended beyond interpretation. David nodded slightly and said that consequences had already been unfolding quietly through every attempt to maintain inconsistency in explanation, and that the documents were not introducing a new reality, but organizing an existing one that had never been fully acknowledged. There was a long pause after that, and in that pause, Susan slowly stepped back from the table, not in retreat, but in a measured repositioning that suggested acceptance of the structure even if not full agreement with its implications. She said that if this was the direction everything pointed toward, then the only remaining question was not whether the pattern existed, but what acknowledging it would ultimately change. David did not answer immediately, and instead looked at the documents one final time before saying that acknowledgement would not change the past, but it would determine what could no longer be carried forward without clarity. The living room remained unchanged in its physical form, but the function of everything within it had shifted completely, as the conversation that once revolved around disagreement had now become a defined structure of understanding that could no longer return to uncertainty. And I realized that what I had witnessed was not just a confrontation, but the final alignment of a truth that had been forming long before anyone in that room was ready to speak it out loud. This gripping narrative explores how deeply buried truths within complex households can slowly surface through tension, silence, and confrontation between the father and the mother, revealing how fragile trust can become when long-held assumptions begin to collapse within powerful family stories. It follows a carefully unfolding sequence of emotional restraint, logical conflict, and documentary evidence that reshapes the understanding of past events inside an ordinary American home, as the father begins to organize and present structured records that challenge previously accepted memories. The mother responds with controlled resistance, insisting that context and interpretation are essential to preserving accuracy in family stories. The presence of a silent observer intensifies the atmosphere, as each exchanged word and each repositioned document transforms the living space into a psychological battleground where truth and perception compete within family stories. The narrative highlights how repetition of patterns across time creates a sense of unavoidable structure, forcing both the father and the mother to reassess what they believed was stable reality. Emotional escalation is not driven by chaos, but by precision, as carefully chosen words and measured reactions slowly dismantle long-standing assumptions embedded in family stories. As the confrontation progresses, the boundary between memory and documentation becomes increasingly blurred, leading both the father and the mother to question whether interpretation can still override consistent evidence within family stories. In the final stage of the unfolding conflict, the accumulation of aligned records forces a quiet but irreversible shift in understanding. where neither denial nor defense can fully contain what has already been revealed, leaving the legacy of family stories permanently altered and redefining the meaning of truth within family stories. Character 1. A middle-aged white female fictional character around 45 years old, wearing simple casual home attire with neutral tones, standing in a frontal view portrait, realistic photography style, soft natural lighting, neutral expression, detailed skin texture, indoor background, cinematic realism, high detail focus on face and eyes. Character 2. A middle-aged white male fictional character around 48 years old, wearing simple casual home attire with muted colors, standing in a frontal view portrait, realistic photography style, soft natural lighting, calm, serious expression, detailed facial texture, indoor background, cinematic realism, high detail focus on face and eyes. Scene 1. Inside a dim suburban living room at night. Character 1 and Character 2 face each other across a table covered with scattered documents and papers, tension visible in their posture and expressions as they engage in a heated emotional confrontation, each pointing at different pages, their voices implied through intense body language. The atmosphere heavy and claustrophobic, shadows cast by a single overhead light emphasizing the seriousness of the conflict and the breakdown of trust between them. Scene 2. Character 1 in a quiet morning kitchen setting, wearing simple casual home clothes, standing alone while preparing coffee and organizing household items, her expression calm but distant, suggesting hidden emotional burden. Sunlight gently entering through a window highlighting the contrast between outward normal life and inner tension. Scene 3. Character 2 in a modest home office space during daytime, seated at a desk reviewing documents and notes, surrounded by organized papers and a laptop. His expression focused and controlled, conveying a sense of responsibility and quiet determination, with a neutral domestic background reinforcing everyday normality. Scene 4. In the same living room at night, Character 1 and Character 2 stand together but separated emotionally, while a third unseen opposing presence is implied through scattered disrupted documents and tense body language. Both characters reacting strongly, as if confronted by undeniable information. The environment feeling unstable and charged with conflict. Scene 5. A close emotional moment inside the kitchen. Character 1 and Character 2 stand near the table, but no longer arguing. Instead, both appear conflicted and reflective, the documents now neatly stacked, suggesting a shift from confrontation to realization, with softer lighting indicating a temporary pause in conflict. Scene 6. Final scene outside the suburban house at early morning light. Character 1 walking away from the house alone, while Character 2 remains near the doorway looking after her, the atmosphere calm but emotionally heavy, symbolizing irreversible separation and the conclusion of their shared family narrative. Character 1 and Character 2 facing each other in a dim living room at night, documents on table, intense disagreement, strong emotional tension, realistic cinematic lighting. Character 1 alone in a bright kitchen morning, calmly making coffee, quiet reflective mood, natural sunlight through window, everyday home setting. Character 2 alone in a home office daytime, reviewing papers and notes at desk, focused and serious mood, simple domestic background. Character 1 and Character 2 in same living room, standing near scattered documents, emotional tension and uncertainty, muted lighting, tense atmosphere. Character 1 and Character 2 in kitchen, calmer mood, documents neatly stacked, reflective silence, soft lighting, emotional pause after conflict. Character 1 walking away from suburban house early morning. Character 2 standing at doorway watching, quiet emotional ending, soft natural light.